So as I was saying, welcome back to Introduction to Political Theory. Today we start with lectures on our first book, Plato's Republic. Those of you who did the reading for today know this is a very challenging book. First time I read this book, I thought it was fascinating. I really hadn't read anything like it. It was my introduction to philosophy of any kind, not just political philosophy. And I probably got on a first read, and this is in retrospect, on that first read, I probably got half of it. So this book is extremely complex. It's not the easiest going. It may be interesting or intriguing to you, but if you're not getting every line, that's not a problem. So hopefully you're able to get some of the gist and some of the points, and then coming to lecture and having those points clarified, reinforced, and developed. Okay, so with that said, I hope you were able to get that the main theme of Plato's Republic is justice. So the first thing I want to do today is introduce how the book introduces the major theme of justice. The second thing I want to do is talk about how Socrates, the main character in the book, tries to refute or show the problems with conventional views of justice. The third thing I want to do today, that's a typo, that should be three. Three I's, not two, sorry about that. Third thing I want to do is talk about how Socrates, the main character of the book, tries to refute an unconventional view of justice. Okay, and that will bring us to the end of the session. Socrates, as I mentioned, is the main character of this dialogue. We call this dialogue a Platonic dialogue because it was written by Plato. Plato and Socrates lived in Athens. Athens was a city-state. So remember from last lecture, we were talking about the polis and how the city-state, these cities of tens of thousands of people, were the basic units of ancient Greek society. Socrates, Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle are probably the big three philosophers associated with the Athenian city-state. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. We're not dealing with Aristotle in this class, but the important point is that Plato was Socrates' student. And so there was a kind of teacher-student, you could even say a kind of master-disciple relationship going on between them. So when you're getting the view, this kind of portrait of Socrates, always remember that it's coming from a very, let's call it pro-Socrates source. And also remember that you're seeing Plato's own perspective, Plato's own commitments and his own values, and how he's trying to positively portray Socrates. So try and pay attention to the ways that Socrates is positively characterized to get a glimpse of Plato's own mind. So Plato doesn't appear in this dialogue, but I would say he's on every page of it. Plato's the author, Socrates the character. Why do we call Socrates a philosopher? First of all, it's because the word philosopher derives from the Greek words for love and wisdom. So the philo part, that's the love part. It's not erotic love, it's Platonic love, named after Plato, the guy who wrote this dialogue. So the love part is a kind of platonic love. It's like an intellectual or a spiritual love. And the Sophie part comes from Sophos. And Sophos is just Greek for wisdom. So one of the things that made it very easy to characterize Socrates as a philosopher was he was well known as a lover of wisdom. And there's a very interesting story attached to that, to this characterization. Socrates was told by an oracle that he was the wisest man in all of Greece. So an oracle, if you don't know this term, an oracle was kind of like a priest, but more like a religious figure. They would do these things called divinations. They would try and interpret signs from the gods to explain what the gods wanted, to explain the will of the gods, and so forth. They, as it were, had a kind of direct hotline to the gods. Remember, for the ancient Greeks, there were many gods. This is prior to monotheism, the idea of one God, one ultimate God, and so forth. Okay, so anyway, Socrates was told by the Oracle of Delphi that he was the wisest person in all of Greece. Now, this confused Socrates a little bit because Socrates was the kind of guy who was always emphasizing what he didn't know. There's a very famous kind of Socratic maxim, a saying, where Socrates says something to the effect of, all I know is what I don't know. And so if you hear people talking in that way today, that's part of the Socratic legacy. But because Socrates took the gods seriously and took the oracle seriously and was genuinely curious, well, if I've got wisdom, what exactly is wisdom? He went about trying to test this proposition, this proposal that he had wisdom somehow, even though he didn't quite believe that he had it. So what he did is he went around, especially his own city-state, Athens, and started getting in these dialogues, these Q&A sessions. So he would go to people with the highest reputations for wisdom, and he would try and initiate intellectual conversations with them. For example, in a very famous dialogue called the Euthyphro, Socrates was talking to a religious guy, a religious man, not an oracle, but more like a priest, this time more like a priest, Euthyphro, who had a reputation for being pious and holy and somehow blessed. Okay, so here's Socrates. Euthyphro, you've got a reputation. Everybody says that you are one of the holiest men around. Euthyphro probably says pleasantries to the effect of, welcome, Socrates, very happy to be in this dialogue, etc. Socrates then wants to cut straight to the point. Socrates will ask Euthyphro, surely if you are a holy man, you know what holiness is. So let me ask you, just very straightforward manner, let me ask you, Euthyphro, what is holiness? What does it mean to be holy? And Euthyphro would probably say something, actually this is what he said. Euthyphro said, in this Platonic dialogue, Euthyphro says, holy is what is favored by the gods. So it's a pretty straightforward answer. And for most people, they would be satisfied and maybe nod their head in reverence, oh, this is a holy man, and so forth, but this is not Socrates' style. Socrates annoyed a lot of people precisely because of this style. He wouldn't let it go. He wants to keep digging. He wants to go deeper. And what Socrates said to Euthyphro was, okay, you say holiness is what is favored by the gods. But a quick question, can we get a little clarification on your formula, on your definition, really? Because what Euthyphro is trying to do is define what is holy, trying to get a concept, a defined concept of holiness. Socrates asks, clarifying question, do the gods love it because it is holy? Or is something holy because the gods love it? In other words, is something holy as a consequence of the gods loving it? Or is the gods loving it a cause of its holiness? And at this point, you can imagine Euthyphro starts stumbling around. He doesn't have a good answer. And in fact, around this point, the dialogue ends. There's a little more back and forth, but it kind of ends on this note of being unresolved. The question is not resolved. Now, you can imagine if you were Euthyphro and you were used to people paying you a lot of respect and a lot of mind, and you had a reputation for holiness, and you just got into this public dialogue with Socrates, who basically showed that you don't have a good idea of the very thing you are best known for. You can imagine that a lot of these, quote, wise men, people who were probably more sure than Socrates of their own wisdom, were embarrassed. And you can imagine that a lot of these wise men, this is like the powerful and the influential and the rich, had a lot of friends who may themselves have been embarrassed by Socrates. So it was no surprise that Socrates was eventually charged before a law court, before a jury of his peers. The Athenian law courts actually, it wasn't 12 people in a room like we have in the United States. These juries were composed of hundreds and hundreds of fellow citizens. There were something like 500 citizens at Socrates' trial. And Socrates' trial charged him with not believing in the gods, not being pious, not being reverent towards the gods. So the first charge was basically impiousness. And the second charge was corrupting the youth, teaching them wrong things. Now, the first thing you'll notice here is that these charges were at bottom religious and moral. And you could be charged for those things back in ancient Greece. They didn't have ideas, American-like ideas, United Kingdom-like ideas of church and state and so forth. Okay, so Socrates was condemned to death. Socrates, whom Plato considered to be the wisest person in his city-state, Athens. Socrates, the person whom the Oracle of Delphi says was the wisest person, not just in Athens, but in all of Greece, was condemned to death by a jury of his peers. So for Plato, and Plato lived through this ordeal, it's kind of a traumatic experience for him. The question is, why did Socratic philosophy and democratic politics come into conflict? So let me just try and unpack this line here on the slide a little bit. So Socratic philosophy is this process of basically trying to define concepts, to ask people like Euthyphro, what is holiness? Okay? And then the next step is to basically test the definition to see if it works, to see if the person who proposed, well, here's what holiness is, can stand up to critical scrutiny, to see if their idea or their proposition passes the test of examination, philosophical examination. So that's a brief characterization of Socratic philosophy. On the other side, we have democratic politics. And Athenians were actually quite proud of their democratic way of life. But as we'll see, Socrates was actually quite skeptical about the Athenian democracy. And Plato, if we can distinguish Socrates from Plato, it's kind of difficult because Socrates is basically the mouthpiece in all of Plato's dialogues, and we don't know much about Socrates apart from Plato. Plato is our main source of our image and our image of Socrates. But democratic politics in Athens basically meant all citizens, and this would have been males and native-born people who were born to the city. So there were definitely limits on this democracy. But in Athenian democracy, all citizens had the right to participate in the legislative process and also to participate on juries. Juries of the kind that had condemned Socrates to death. Okay, so that's the conflict. You see the conflict. The conflict is democratic politics basically thinks Socratic philosophy is corrupt, impious, bad for the youth, and so forth. Okay, so Plato, in trying to suss out what the conflict is, came to the following conclusion. There was no question for Plato that Socrates was a just man. And so to put the point more impersonally and put the point in terms of what Socrates represented, there was no question for Plato that philosophy was just, that philosophy met the standards of justice. There was also, as a consequence of the death of Socrates, the idea for Plato that democracy is unjust, that the people in that jury represented the let's not call it the principles, but the vice of injustice. So you've got philosophy on the one hand, which is meeting the standard of justice, and you've got democracy on the other hand, which is somehow falling below the standard or lacking in that virtue of justice. Now you'll notice here that we haven't even tried to define what justice is, and that is precisely the task of Book 1. So Plato starts this dialogue not by trying to give a abstract definition of justice. So if Plato were to take this tack, the dialogue would just immediately start off with the question, what is justice? And then somebody would try and answer, well, here's what I think it is. It's not justice in general. It's a more specific question. It's the question of how does one live a just life? How does one embody justice in their everyday actions and their thoughts and their feelings? In short, what does justice for the individual look like? Okay, not justice as the concept or justice as the ideal or something like that. But what does justice look like for the self? The first answer comes from Cephalus. Cephalus is an aged businessman. The thing about Cephalus is he actually lives justice. He embodies justice. But he is unable to state the principles of his lifestyle. He is unable to state, well, what is the just life? Another way of putting this point is Cephalus has correct opinions about how to live his life. If you ask him about his attitudes towards money, for example, he notes, well, Socrates, I've noticed among my circles, the business community of Athens, that it's really hard to live well if you don't have money, because you're always scrounging and worried and anxious about, where the household revenue is going to come in. But on the flip side, Socrates, I've seen some very rich and very miserable people, and nobody would say that they are living well. So he has the right attitude towards money. However, when Socrates asks Cephalus, well, that's great. Could you expand that understanding of how to live with regards to money into a broader account of how one lives, period? In other words, at this point, Socrates is asking about, Cephalus, what's your idea of the just life? And this is where Cephalus's correct opinions do not quite add up into knowledge of the just life. Cephalus says, well, Socrates, I'll tell you what I think about the just life. The just life is basically returning what is borrowed. Now, remember, Cephalus is a businessman, so you can imagine in the course of Cephalus's everyday life, okay, he goes to a friend, borrows 100, whatever the currency was back then. Let's, just for the purposes of this example, say $100. Goes to his friend next door, borrows $100, and according to Cephalus's definition, it would be just if he returned that $100 sometime. Okay, Socrates says, hey, that kind of makes sense. I see what you're saying. Surely a just person returns what he borrows. However, can that really be the definition of justice? Why, Socrates says? Because I can think of many cases where returning what is borrowed doesn't actually work out and isn't the kind of thing that a just person would do. For example, Cephalus, if your friend lent you a knife and you used that knife for a little while, put it away in your knife drawer, and a little while later, your friend came back with crazy eyes and making stabbing motions and looking enraged and saying, Cephalus, I really need my knife back right now. Would it be just to return what is borrowed? Cephalus, yeah, you're right, Socrates. I can see some problems with this definition. But I'd love to stay in chat, but I've got to go out and make some sacrifices to the gods. Which is Cephalus's tactful way of saying, I don't know the answer to your question, Socrates, and in fact, this is kind of boring. I'm gonna go do something else. But note, it's not that sarcastic because he's going out to sacrifice to the gods, once again showing that he has character. Once again showing that even though he can't state why he's living justly, he actually, in his actions, is living justly. So he leaves to make sacrifices. So at this point, Polemarchus, his son, takes over the dialogue. So now it's Socrates arguing in dialogue with Polemarchus. Polemarchus, his son, has a little more of that philosophical mind. He's going to be able to hang a little bit longer with the Socratic dialogue. He's going to have a little bit more precise answers. What does Polemarchus answer? Polemarchus says, Socrates, you know, that's not what my father really meant. What my father really meant is you've got to give people their due. That's the more general answer as to what justice is. And so if your friend is wild-eyed and crazy and looking to kill somebody, it's not their due to give them their knife back at that moment. So you can see here that if Dad had just adjusted his formulation a little bit, it would still work. If you're a true friend to your friend, you're only going to help them. You're not going to let themselves you're not going to let them do something they later regret, like kill somebody with a knife. Conversely, you would very likely, if you're a just person, do harm to those who are trying to do you harm. If an enemy comes and says, hey, I need a sword, or perhaps even tries to attack you with his sword to try and get yours, you obviously would try and fight back. Okay, so Polemarchus says, justice is actually a matter of giving people their due, and giving people their due means helping people who are your friends and hurting people who are your enemies. Now, this is an equally conventional view. If Cephalus is taking his view from the ancient business world, Polemarchus is taking his view from the ancient field of battle. It's warfare, basically. He's talking about friends and enemies. And he's talking about fighting and protecting. Socrates says, I see what you're doing, Polemarchus. You're kind of sharpening up Cephalus's definition, and I agree. This is a better definition. And in fact, all these poets and so forth, they agree with you. So this is Plato, the writer of the dialogue, saying, yeah, this is conventional. This is a conventional view. A bunch of people believe it. For a lot of people in Athens and probably the rest of Greece, which is a very warlike society, as we'll talk about later, this probably is common sense. How does Socrates start to test this view? Socrates says, Polemarchus, would you agree? And you'll notice Socrates is always saying to his partner in dialogue, would you agree? Would you agree that just like on the battlefield, the practitioner of justice can do it more or less well? So in the same way a soldier can fight more or less well, the just individual can act justly more or less. Polemarchus says, well, yeah, definitely, of course, I agree. And he doesn't say this outright, but this is the logic. And as we all know, Socrates, some people are really bad at justice because they treat their friends like garbage and they treat their enemies really well. So you can do it wrong, in other words. Socrates, totally agree, Polemarchus, totally agree. So it seems like justice is a kind of art or a craft or a skill or an expertise. You can do it wrong, and some people do it better than others. Polemarchus, absolutely. To think otherwise is like saying there's no such thing as one soldier being better than another or one general being better than another. Socrates, yeah, so you're kind of saying that justice is an art or a craft, like being a general, or like being a doctor, or like being a painter, or like being any other thing. We can say that some people are doing better than others, and when we can say they're doing it better than others on the grounds of some impersonal standard or impersonal expertise that they have to fulfill. Um, the justice of a doctor, for example, is very important to think about here. Why? Socrates thinks that this example shows that all arts and crafts help, they don't harm. It doesn't matter if the patient happens to be a friend or the patient has to be an enemy. So what does Socrates mean by this? Socrates is saying that, for example, if two city-states are at war, and there's a doctor who belongs to city-state A, and there are wounded people who have surrendered, wounded soldiers from city-state B who have surrendered. It's the duty of the doctor to help, to try and cure, to try and help these soldiers from city-state B survive. In other words, it doesn't matter to the doctor whether they're friends or enemies, whether they belong to his city-state or her city-state. Back then it would have been his city-state or the other enemy city-state. At this point, Polemarchus has to agree. He says, yeah, what you said about the doctor, what you said about the art or craft of medicine has to be correct. Okay. Socrates says, okay, so you agree. Arts or crafts benefit everybody, irrespective of their friend or enemy status. At which point Polemarchus says, I see what you're doing, Socrates, because if what you've said about medicine is true, then my definition of justice cannot be true. Because I propose that justice is a matter of helping friends and harming enemies. But I also said that justice is an art or a craft. And arts and crafts, as we've just discussed through the doctor example, help everyone and harm no one. So there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction. So let's take a step back and see what this Socratic Q&A method is all about. Socratic method is about getting your partner in dialogue to propose something and getting them to agree every step of the way. So you're reasoning from common premises. Would you agree, Polemarchus, that justice is an art or a craft? So you reason from these common premises to a common conclusion. The common conclusion, Polemarchus himself admitted that his own definition had unacceptable consequences, like a doctor, instead of helping to cure everybody, would go about trying to kill some people. Okay, so the Socratic method, in a word, is about exposing self-contradictions. So Socrates just refuted two conventional views. To review, the first was justice is a matter of returning what is borrowed. The second is justice is a matter of helping friends and harming enemies. At this point, Socrates is going to take on an unconventional view, one represented by the character of Thrasymachus. There is a dramatic shift in the tone of the dialogue. Thrasymachus bursts into the dialogue, as you'll see on page 15 and 16 of the Penguin edition. If you don't have this edition, don't worry about it. I'm about to read from it. Even while we were talking, Thrasymachus had attempted several times to break into the conversation, but had been held back by those sitting by him because they wanted to hear how the discussion would turn out. So you'll notice here, there's a subtle jab at Thrasymachus. Those around him wanted to hear how the dialogue would turn out. They were curious. Well, what is justice? Who knows? We're curious. Thrasymachus is more like raring to go. He wants to get in to the dialogue. He can't restrain himself. As you'll notice here, he had to be held back by others. So Thrasymachus somehow lacks self-restraint. Now, as we paused with that last question of mine, he couldn't be contained any longer. So the metaphor here is that Thrasymachus is like, he's like a volcano that just has to burst. And now to shift the metaphor, Plato writes, gathering himself together like some wild animal, Thrasymachus launched himself at us as if to tear us to pieces, making Polemarchus and myself, Socrates, shake with terror. So the metaphor shifted from this kind of uncontainable force of nature that had to be held back by other people to wild animal trying to devour. And it's a violent metaphor. And basically Socrates thinks that Thrasymachus is some kind of wild beast. So these points I've already made. Thrasymachus has great difficulty controlling himself. He's lacking in restraint. He's somehow violent, even though he's not physically attacking. What we're going to see is Thrasymachus thinks that words are like weapons, that the point of words is to win and defeat your opponents. In the same way that a soldier might think his weapons are tools to use to force the enemy into submission. He's also wild. He's characterized as a beast. So the description implies that there's something not quite human about him, that he's not using his most human faculty of reason, that in fact Thrasymachus is being driven by something else, that these passions within him to fight and even to devour his fellow humans, that's the wild beast devouring us, that there's something off about this, that there's something off about Thrasymachus's character. In the same way that Socrates doesn't just represent himself, but rather represents a broader type, the philosopher, Thrasymachus does not just represent himself. There was a whole class of Thrasymachoses in the ancient Greek world. They were called sophists. Sophists took their name, like philosophers took their name from the Greek word for wisdom. You can see it there. Sophos. It's the beginning of sophist. But for Socrates and for Plato, the sophists and the philosophers couldn't be farther apart. They were often confused for one another, but there was a core difference. The sophists did not actually care about what was true or what was false. They did not actually care for what was noble and what was base. They didn't have a strong kind of ethical sense in the way that Socrates and Plato did. What they did have, and they had it in spades, was a very competitive spirit. The kind of competitive spirit that ancient Greeks would have seen in the Olympic Games, for example, or in the constant warfare that the ancient Greek city-states were engaged in. So he's competitive and he likes to win. He likes to compete and he likes winning even more. And sophists had a special skill. Their skill was going around and teaching the powerful people in the city-state how to use their words like weapons and how to use those rhetorical weapons to defeat their adversaries. And for all this, they would charge fees. They would charge money. Socrates did not. They claimed to be very useful to the rich and powerful. Socrates, as we'll see, just the opposite. He was antagonistic. He was no friend of the rich and powerful. In fact, as we saw in the trial of Socrates, most of them thought he was just over the top, annoying, irritating. So irritating, they wanted him dead. So to be clear, the problem is not that Thrasymachus is stupid. If we're just talking about raw horsepower, Thrasymachus has got quite a bit of it. He's clever. He's not, at least on Plato's account, wise, but he's clever. Probably score real high on standardized testing and so forth these days. He's confident. He really believes in himself. He believes in himself and his abilities, and he believes that other people find him convincing. Probably for good reason. He's a professional orator. He's a professional speaker. So he's got a bit of charisma to him. If he didn't, people really wouldn't be hiring him. All these characteristics, cleverness, confidence, charisma, are meant to come across in Thrasymachus's long-winded, paragraph-long, page-long speeches, which are the explicit point of contrast to Socrates' shorter Q&A style, where Thrasymachus is trying to give these long speeches, and yes, he's still talking, yes, he's still developing the point. The point of all that is to kind of overawe the audience, to get the audience excited, to get the audience on his side and not his opponent's side, Socrates in this case. Whereas you'll notice with Socrates, when Socrates is talking to you, he's one-on-one, one at a time. His attention's on you, and he wants you to agree. He wants you to use your own reason and not get carried away by your emotions to see what your reason tells you about what you just said. So the techniques of argument, the techniques of dialogue are actually very different because they have different aims. Thrasymachus's aim is to win. Socrates' aim is to find out what's true. Again, again, this is according to Plato. Always keep that in mind. If Thrasymachus's character is somehow corrupted and he doesn't really have that philosophical spirit, that philosophical love of wisdom, because he is too much in love with power and riches and gain. Now, you can imagine somebody with a character like that would not actually think too highly of this word justice. And I say this word because that's pretty much what Thrasymachus is saying. He's saying justice is just a word. There's really no such thing as justice. So there's no concept of justice that can be defined objectively in a way that is acceptable to all parties. Rather, everyone who uses the word justice, according to Thrasymachus, is actually doing it for their own gain. Today, we'd say they're using justice as a cover for their self-interest. Let's look a little more closely at what Thrasymachus proposes justice is. And justice, all these scare quotes are to show that he really is using the term ironically. He doesn't really believe there's a such thing as justice. Thrasymachus says that justice is whatever is in the interests of the stronger. And Socrates says, well, that's very intriguing, Thrasymachus. That is certainly not a conventional view, and I've never heard it before. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by justice is the interest of the stronger? Thrasymachus probably says something sarcastic like, well, that's because you're too slow, Socrates, and you need to catch up. Let me lay it out for you plain. Justice is what the ruling party in a city-state claims is good for everybody, but in reality is only good for the ruling party. So if there's a monarch, for example, if there's a king ruling a city-state, of course they're going to try and tell the plebs, the people, that their policies are to the benefit of the entire city and that the king loves his city-state and so forth. But actually what you'll see is all those policies end up reinforcing the power of the monarchy and making the monarchs richer. And it's the same difference in democracy. Democracies love saying, oh, we believe in justice and we're on the side of justice, we're against the rich and powerful and so forth. But if that's so, why do democracies, the ruling power is basically the demos, the many, and the many were mostly poor. If democracies really believe in justice for all instead of justice for the part, justice for themselves, why is it that democracies are always trying to have progressive income taxes and take money away from the rich and the powerful? Because that benefits the ruling party. So Socrates at this point wants to know, Thrasymachus, very interesting stuff, very interesting. Would you agree that the ruling party, in order to pursue its interests and in order to convince other people that what are in its interests are for the benefit of all, that the ruling party needs to have a certain kind of skill or expertise? Aren't there ways that the ruling party can do their justice well or pursue their justice badly? Thrasymachus says, well, of course, that's absolutely right. And that's why when the ruler, for example, is mistaken about what's in his interest, or if the ruling class is mistaken about what's in its interest, they aren't acting justly. They're making mistakes. They're doing it wrong. Socrates then says, hey, well, haven't you just admitted that justice is an art or a craft? The art or a craft of ruling. Thrasymachus says, wow, you really are slow. Of course that's what I'm saying. I just said it. But you see here, Thrasymachus just set himself up. You'll see that Polemarchus, remember the guy who said justice is helping friends and harming enemies, Socrates, the one conducting this entire dialogue, and Thrasymachus, the one who said that justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger, they have all agreed that justice is an art or a craft, or an expertise or a specialization. That's what allows us to say some people do it better than others, and that's what allows us to say some people are doing it wrong. But haven't we already established that an expertise aims at the good for everybody? And now Socrates is going to take it an extra step. So you go back to the doctor. The doctor doesn't just do good to everybody in general. The doctor does good to the patient under their power. In other words, the doctor example shows that the practitioner of medicine benefits not the stronger party, but the weaker party, to use Thrasymachus's terms. You see how Socrates is positioning himself and trying to refute what Thrasymachus is saying. In other words, look, when it comes to medicine, the doctor is in the stronger position. They have more knowledge and they have more expertise. Who's in the weaker position? The patient. The patient is the one who has less knowledge and has to listen to what the doctor says in order to produce health in themselves. So it's not the one who wields the power, but the one who is subject to the power that expertise helps. At this point, Thrasymachus says, this is totally naive what you're saying, Socrates. What you're saying, what you're trying to convince us, is that a sheep herder raises sheep for the benefit of the sheep instead of the benefit of the sheep herder. In other words, the sheep herder is interested in raising those sheep well only insofar as it generates him a profit. And it's the same thing with the doctor, Socrates. I don't see how you can be so naive to think that the main thing that motivates doctors is social status, having a lot of money, living in a big house, and so forth. Socrates has a very simple reply to this. There are two problems with what you just said, Thrasymachus. The first is you're confusing the art of money making with a whole variety of expertises. If all a doctor did was make money and did not produce health for the patient, we would not call that doctor a doctor. We would call them a quack. We'd call them a quack. In other words, the fact that there are fees accompanying, there are fees to see a doctor, doesn't mean that making money and having high social status is part of the definition of being a doctor. So that's one problem. And so what Socrates has tried to show is that it may look like the point of being a doctor are these side benefits, but don't forget that the main point of being a doctor is to actually help your patients. So to extend the analogy, Socrates is saying, let's talk about the art of ruling. We've got to be able to distinguish between the side benefits, say the honors that people who occupy political offices are endowed with, versus the actual point of ruling. Ruling, like any art, craft, or expertise, has got to be to the benefit to those who are subject to that power. Okay,